Well, hello and welcome to another DevNation. I'm excited to have you all here today because we're going to have another awesome session with Jay Dobies. He's going to be rocking us through Odl. So if you haven't figured out Odl yet, you're going to hear a lot more about it today. Now, I do see GJ, Maddie, and Waleed in the chat. Good to have you guys back. Always good to have you guys here. We're going to have some fun. And we're going to also, please, throw your questions into that chat. Throw things in there. I'll throw some questions and messages in. But throw them in there. We'll try to get those over to Jay as quickly as possible. But at this point, I want to turn it over to him and let him dive right in. So, Jay, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Burr. I'm going to let you confirm you see my screen, but I'm seeing the sign off, so just kind of yell if you're not. And I'm glad you mentioned the people in chat because I was hoping a couple of my friends that I've seen a couple times this week now. I'm sure DevNation is generally speaking getting sick of seeing me on here. It's been a busy week, but I'm very happy to be back. This is cool because this is a nice, more laid back type of situation. So, topic is going to be Odl or Odoo or ODO. This is one of those products that we created and then nobody really knew what it was called at the time. Previously stood for OpenShift Do, and then we seriously changing the scope of this, and it's going to run on Kubernetes soon, provide a lot more options than just OpenShift. So it's been kind of retconned into just being called Odl or Odoo. I mean, I'm probably going to use it in multiple different ways over the course of the talk. And the title, I have to give credit to Burr on this one because I opted for the more formal sounding title that tells you what Odl is, but I absolutely love this notion. The whole Star Wars thing in Odl actually is going to keep coming up with me because my boss once said the phrase the Odl way, and that reminded me of the Mandalorian. So now every time I think of Odl between this and the Mandalorian reference, it's all Star Wars stuff. So we're going to talk about what that is in a second. We're going to spend the vast majority of our time in a terminal. But a quick introduction. Again, probably quite a few have seen me over the course of this week in the master courses. If you haven't, my name is Jason Dobies, or I also go by Jay. I'm a developer advocate at Red Hat. I've been here for 14 years now, almost exactly 14 years. But I've been doing development in general for close to 20. And that's one of the reasons why this Odl topic is particularly important to me because it focuses all around my inner loop as a developer and how do I make that as painless as possible as we kind of migrate to this container native world. So these slides are going to be available after the talk, so I'm not going to spend too much time leaving this up unless you snap a quick screenshot. But obviously this first link is to download it and play around with it yourself. It's a Go-based binary, so you won't have to install a ton of dependencies. And then you can obviously also grab that. I'm pretty sure it's in Brew. I'm pretty sure it's in DNF at this point. There's a cheat sheet on the second line. If you're familiar with the developer's website, you've seen cheat sheets there before. There was a recently added Odl one that I actually wrote. And apologies, I'm looking down. I'm trying to get a clock set up so I don't run over time. And then this tutorial here is this interactive scenario where it's going to provide a cluster for you. It's going to have instructions on the left side and then this open-ended cluster on the right that you're going to be able to play with at your own pace and kind of learn things out. And then the source code for the examples we're going to be using today. So in case you wanted to follow along and try to do it yourself. Okay, so what is ODO? The shortest version is it's an alternate CLI to OpenShift that is very developer focused. Now, I'm going to keep saying for OpenShift, but again, I really want to stress that we are in the process of migrating this or porting it or however we want to phrase it over to be able to run on Kubernetes as well. So as of right now, it's limited to OpenShift, but bear with us. Pretty soon, we're going to be able to do more than just that. As I'm talking, I'm suddenly realizing that I forgot to run an initial setup here. So we're going to let that run in the background like start. I'm sorry?
Yeah, we can see the sausage being made.
Yeah, exactly. So I should probably comment on what this part is, though, because this is a bit relevant. OpenShift has a service catalog notion that has been largely replaced with this operator concept over the course of this 4.0 release. ODO is still upgrading to work with operators. So right now it leverages the existing service catalog. So I'm just simply running a playbook to enable it. I mean, you can see some of the stuff here. It's not terribly interesting going on. But this is a brand new cluster that I provisioned this morning. So I forgot by default it wasn't enabled by the way we provisioned them. But it's important to know that when we get to listing services and playing with that stuff, you're going to need the service catalog available. Not too hard to set up. It's fully documented in documentation. Nothing weird going on there. Okay, so it's a developer-focused CLI. And the idea is we want to expedite a lot of the operations that are typically more heavyweight and quite frankly get in the way of that inner loop and make it as fast as possible to get our code out there. So like I said, I have 18, 19 years of development experience at this point, and I'm very set in my own ways. And having it that long means I was kind of raised on my IDE plus command line type of mentality. So we have all these new projects coming out, code-ready workspaces and the visual code plugins, which are cool. And I'm not going to say not for me, but my gut reaction is I like to type my code. I like to just run Maven, and then a couple seconds later, my service is up. I test it. When there's the inevitable bug, I kill that, recompile, and run it again. And I'm sure everyone on this call, especially coming into DevNation, you're used to that sort of inner loop where you'll have things set up and you'll understand this is where this terminal is and this is the right directory and it's type, boom, wait a couple seconds and then it's running. And that worked really well. It still works really well. You saw how quickly I started up that Spring application. It's even faster if we're using Quarkus. I'm going to get my little plug-in there. This example just happens to use direct Spring, but this actually becomes even faster if you're in this Quarkus world. So little plug there. Now, if you've ever done this in a container, this is a little more painful. You have to make your Docker file. You have to build your image. You have to push your image to a repo. You have to pull that image back into your orchestration engine, your OpenShift, your Kubernetes. You have to recreate your deployment with the new image. And all that to find out you made a stupid typo of a bug, and you got to repeat that whole process. And that fundamental, or that annoyance is fundamental to why ODO came into existence. So with a little bit of prep, it mostly makes sense to just get started. So I'm going to start by creating a demo project. I'm going to do ODO demo. This should be good on the service broker. Now, everything, I want to say this now, I'm going to point this out a few more times. Everything I'm doing could be solely done through ODO. Now, you're going to see me use the OC command a few times as a sanity check, just to relate things back to what ODO is doing versus what you would have done traditionally using OC. But realize that nothing that I'm going to be doing using OC is required here. I can live this entire lifecycle in ODO. That said, we're not replacing ODO. We're not replacing OC. We're supplementing it. So there are going to be things you can't do in ODO because it's this very opinionated-ish, developer-focused CLI. But again, for the purposes of this demo, when you factor out my explanations and the things that I do for demo purposes, try to distill from that how quickly it is to take this code and just get it running inside of my cluster. So I've done this ODO project create, and you'll see if I do an OC project, cool, we have our demo project as we would expect, and that's awesome. I could run Maven package here to build it. We just ran that quick demo, so we know it's already built. So I want to tell ODO to create me what is known as a component. And this component is going to house my Java application and be able to push it into the cluster and get it running. So to break this down a little bit, I'm using a Java 8 base for this as the runtime. Backend is simply my name for this component. And I guess I should explain. If you saw Jan's talk last week, she showed multiple ways to deploy this concession kiosk front end. This is the back end. This is going to be the full project from front end to back end. So a front end in Node.js, a back end in Java, and then we're also going to deploy a database and attach it to the back end. So we're going to build a little bit upon the basic front end that she deployed last week. Really, it just makes for a great demo that we have this simple 3-tiered application that we want to be able to start hacking on pretty quickly. So we've created this component locally, and then the only other piece in here, I should say more than that. We said this is going to be a binary component. Now, we're not going to do that for Node.js. We're not going to do that for other languages. We could even get around doing that in Java, but for explanation purposes, I wanted to point out that we're doing the build locally, and we're saying this is going to be a binary component. When you deploy this to the cluster, I want you to just take this binary and have that running in the cloud, or running in the cluster. See, get. So I'm going to set up this OC get at the bottom, just so you can see what happens as I trigger this push command. Now, if you see something like push, you immediately start relating that back to git, and that's not the worst analogy to make here. What I did with that OC create command, and I can scroll up if we need to see it again, but as I created this local notion of the component. So the component's going to live in my current project. We call that demo. Again, it's going to have a Java runtime to it. It's going to be named backend, which we see come up a little bit in the pod name here in the middle. In the ODO CLI, that's going to be a little cleaner, where we just refer to this backend component. And it's meant to be a piece of my application. So what's happening here is when I say push, all of those local changes, which was creating the component, there's other pieces we could create too that we're going to do in a second. All of those are getting pushed into the cluster. So you can see now that we're pretty close. We're just doing the sync now. That means we have our running container out there, and it's uploading that binary. And once that finishes, it's going to start, and the application will be running. We'll have a full-blown pod inside the cluster, which you can see at the bottom here, and it's going to be running this Java application that we sent it. That's finished, thankfully, on time when I finished that thought. So let's look at it. Let's take a look at the application. How? If you know anything about OpenShift, you realize we're going to need a route here. And we don't have one. Let's add that to my watch down here. You'll notice we don't have a route to it. Well, that's great for OpenShift nomenclature, but what am I really doing? Well, I'm creating a URL to my application. So ODO is going to use that terminology. And I'm going to say, I want to create a URL into the current component, and it determines current component by the directory. In this case, we created a component in here, we called it backend, so it's going to attempt to attach this URL to the backend component. Now, ODO is smart. It's going to take a look at it and say, okay, where do you want this URL? Because that particular setup has 3 URLs exposed by default. So we're going to say, port, that URL, sorry. Going to say we created this port for us. Again, keep an eye on the bottom that we don't actually have the route yet, because once again, we have to do a push. And you can see at the very bottom, it gave us this route that was created. I could, again, take it from there, but I want to get you in the habit of realizing that ODO is going to give us this information on its own. So instead of going to an OC command, I can just copy this URL directly from ODO. So I did an ODO URL create. Once I pushed it up to the server, again, kind of following that Git model where I'm making these local changes and then I'm explicitly pushing them into the cluster. And then I'm going to say ODO list to give me the URL for it. So if we do a curl on that, I'm trying to make sure it copied the entire URL, and it looks like it did. It's a simple REST API. I added this this debug endpoint to it as kind of a way of testing whether or not it's connected to the database. And we'll see it's not, and that's not a surprise. We don't actually have a database yet. So let's create one. We know that we've created a component for our code and our running applications. There's another concept called a service. List service. You know, I have it written down on notes too, and I'm like, no, I can totally just wing it. And I always forget the order here. ODO catalog list services with a plural. Okay, apologies for that. And you see a lot came down here. And this is that Ansible step you saw me quickly run at the beginning when I said, nobody look for a second, I'm doing backend stuff. This comes out of our service catalog, and ODO is dynamically querying the cluster and saying, hey, what services do you have available that we can deploy? We know we want to deploy a database, and I'm not going to scroll up, but bear with me that there was one in that list called MongoDB ephemeral. So I'm going to ask Odoo, go to your catalog, and again, catalog is going to show us its component types, so Java, Ruby, Python, but it's for the services, it's going to show us all of the different things we can connect to our application. So I'm going to ask it for some information. Apparently not. I'm going to ask it to list. I'll try that again. There we go. And it's going to tell us a lot of information. That's a little bit rough to see because of how I have things zoomed in. It's going to tell us, hey, you have all of these different parameters that you can configure when you're creating this service. And that's okay. That's going to be useful, but going to be also a bit complicated. So what if we had an interactive way of doing that for us? What if ODO was going to guide us through that? Create. I have no idea why my typing is messing up so badly today. It's serious. Oh my God. Apologies for that. My notes are apparently atrocious for this. The ordering of just stupid things get in my way. So we're going to create a service, and we're going to put it in the app concession. So it's going to belong to the same area as backend. But if I don't specify anything, I don't specify a specific service, it's going to give me this interactive menu. So we know we want a database. We know we want this MongoDB ephemeral database. And I'm just picking ephemeral here just to make things simpler and to start up a little bit quicker. I have to accept most of the defaults. I'm going to name it database just to make things read a little bit easier. I'm going to hit yes on this output, and I'll explain that in a second. We're going to ask it to wait to be ready. So what's happening is Odl is going to the service catalog. And initially, when I started that create, it did the query to understand these are the different categories of services you have available in your cluster. Now remember, they're read dynamically. Had I not turned on the service catalog, that would have showed me nothing. Had I added specific things for my particular environment, those would have showed up as well. The selected database gave us a scrolling through our various options, and then all of those required variables that the describe command told us we would have to provide. And they could have been provided at the command line. We just did interactively. So I left them to the defaults here because for demo purposes, this works fine. What we're going to see in a minute is this output, this non-interactive version. This is really handy because it's going to spit us out the command line that we could have run to produce this. So if this interactive mode doesn't work for you because you want to tie it into some kind of CI/CD or you want to automate your developer setup, you can have it generate for you the command that you would have to type to recreate exactly what it is I did by the interactive version. We see that comes up in this purple here, and it's really nothing surprising in there, but it's just a lot to type out. So if I don't want to have to remember those and have to retype in all the variables, this interactive mode is super useful. And I could have done that for the Java or for the Node.js example coming later. So I'll do a quick OC get on pods, and we should see a database pod running out there. So if I do our curl command again to see if our database is connected to our Java application, it's still not connected. And that's not a surprise because we've deployed our database, we've deployed our application, but we haven't actually told them about each other yet. There's a command for that in ODO called link. And what that's going to do is set up a relationship between two components, or a component and a service. So I'm going to link the database into the backend, and the command there, I'll have it up on the screen, was ODO link database. Now remember, we named it database when we first created the service. Note here, it's going to terminate our existing backend pod and just restart it pretty quickly. If you're familiar with Kubernetes and OpenShift, that's not a surprise because what we're doing in that linking is exposing environment variables into our component or into our Java code. And anytime you change configurations on a pod or a deployment, it's going to redeploy that pod to pick up those changes. It's not going to dynamically inject them into it. So just like any other time that we would change an environment variable on a deployment and see it get redeployed, same thing happens here. You can see in this output that it tells us the names of the environment variables. So I'm not going to show it, but assume that my Java code is going to look and say, if I see these variables, I'm going to use those to get my database information. If I run my curl command again, we come back and we say connected is true. So we've connected to our database. Now this took us about 8 to 10 minutes to get to because of all the talk. But ultimately, if you think back to what I did, I created the Java-based component, said, here's the binary, here's what I want you to name it. I created a URL using another command, which was literally URL create. And then I pushed that up to the server, and now I had my entire backend application running. I then went through the service catalog to figure out I want to create a MongoDB database. I went through the interactive mode just to make it simpler to fill out all the values, and then that got created for me as well. And then another single command, ODO link, and I linked the two up. So my database and my backend are now talking to each other, and the backend's able to connect to it. This is really cool when you boil it down to just those commands. If I was new to this project and I wanted to get things running and quickly be able to start developing, it's just a handful of commands that I could have even scripted out. So let's hop over to the front end because this gets a little more interesting when you can see everything running together. We're going to create this one as a Node.js front end. Note we don't have this binary flag because we're not doing anything in terms of this pre-compilation step locally or anything like that. You're also going to see me batch up these changes locally. So again, with that Git model where I've made a couple of local changes before I decided I'm actually going to push them to the server. So we're going to see that it's already generated what this URL is going to be for us, and it's going to push these files up to the server. Take this moment to very quickly pull a browser available so I can show you once the application gets running. But it's doing something very similar to what it did in the Java backend. It's standing up a container. I can use that name. And you'll see it's starting up this Node.js base image, and then it's going to copy my code up to it and then start the running server. We're pretty close, actually. I don't need to vamp through this too much more, but we'll have our front end running as a container inside. Notice as well, I didn't run anything with Docker files there. ODO is handling all of that for me. I simply said, I want a Node.js runtime, and I'm letting it figure out all of the rest for me. So it's going to figure out the Docker configuration. It's going to figure out the base images. I don't have to think about any of that. I have this fairly quick way of going from nothing to my deployed application. So we will give it a second to come up. Once the application's running, we're still not going to be able to access the database. You know, for as much as I love using tmux in these demos, the copy and paste when it gets that big throws me off, and it chopped off the back half of my URL there. So we have our running concession stand. We can say we want to order a hot dog. We don't want salad. Nobody wants salad. And just a soda. And if we click to place the order, not a real surprise here because this code's not the most stable, but it's going to crash. And that's simply because there is no backend. So we have our backend deployed. We have our database attached to that. Now we need to tell the front end and the back end about each other. So we're going to use the exact same concept. We're going to auto link the back end to the front end. And it's going to tell us, I forgot to put, oh no, port, okay. And it's going to tell us, hey, don't forget you did this with the URL. There's multiple ports for the backend. You need to wire up to it. So we have to explicitly say, I want port 8080. It's funny that that threw me off because I explicitly leave this example like that to showcase that functionality. Once again, it's going to introduce some environment variables into the front end. And our front end code has to understand to use those. That is a small piece that our developers are taking into account. But again, if you've ever done container development, this is really one of your best ways for introducing customization into your running container anyway. So this is a habit most people are already doing. So we have our front end, it's been linked to the back end. It looks like it restarted. So I'll hit refresh. This time we'll throw a burger at it as well. When I place the order, we see a thank you page. And that's because we were able to successfully go to the database or go to the back end and say, I have a new order. The backend returned to us this simple order number, and if I submitted multiple orders, that would change. And it's stored in the database the various things that we're ordering. So that's cool too. We've now taken our entire application and got it deployed in ultimately about 20 minutes with all of my talking. But this step was even simpler because we just said, I want to create Node.js based component. I want to add a URL to it. I want to link it to the backend and then push it up to the server. And it takes care of all of the tedious lifting for me. I very specifically chose that. Heavy is not really the right word. None of this is, the Docker files, the images. None of that process is necessarily bad. But it is a little more time consuming than we want it to be for inner loop. Now, I keep talking about that developer inner loop and that process of write some code, change it, write some code, change it. But I haven't actually showed it yet. So let's do that. If I go into my front end directory, I'm going to set up something called an Odl watch. And if you're familiar with the term watch, you're going to have an idea of what's going to happen here. But it's going to say for changes to this component, and specifically in this case, the front end component, and if it sees any, it's going to sync them up to the server for us. So let's make a quick edit. We're going to edit the index page. And our title is going to say for DevNation. And when I exit, you can quickly see that this watch kicks into effect. This is very similar to, I'm blanking on the exact command, the sync command that exists inside of the OC command as well, where it's going to be able to update my running code with what I have locally. So if you think about this local environment setup, I have local environment, I set up my watch, and I just start typing code. And ODO is going to keep track of uploading that code as I write it and as I hit save into my running container and immediately make it available. So I've taken that somewhat painful, somewhat long inner loop of write some code, build the image, push the image, download the image, deploy the image, and I've reduced it to a single call of basically Odl watch. And it takes care of syncing that code up to me to this running container and making those changes available immediately. I have a little bit of time, so we do one more example here. We're going to leave my watch running at the bottom. And we're going to edit it again, except the title is now going to be pulled from an environment variable. So if I copy that correctly, I hit save, and you'll notice pretty quickly it's going to, again, try to sync that up to the server. Please no one yell at me for my bad Vim process of adding an exclamation point on a save. I got dinged for it last week by a friend of mine, so I know it's a bad practice. I got to get out of it. So we changed it to pull from an environment variable, which we didn't set, so no surprise, we don't actually have a title here. But let's set that. Odl has a way of taking a look at everything going on with the Odl configuration. So this config view is going to tell us some basics about the component configuration. So it's Node.js. Here's the application, which, if I didn't describe it earlier, is a loose relationship between different components and services, and we use concessions in all the cases. Front end, back end, and database, they all belong to this concessions app. And then a few other pieces. I want to tell it to set a configuration, an environment variable, excuse me. And if I go back into view, we can see up at the top here that it's going to show us all of our environment variables. And I'll do another Odl push. This time I'm going to say just send the configuration. And go down here. We should see the front end redeploying because, again, any configuration change to a deployment is going to result in the pod getting redeployed to pick up that config. And we should see once that comes back up, it'll reflect in the UI. So it'll actually pull that environment variable. It'll display it in the browser for us, showing us that everything wired up. The real takeaway here is that I'm able to work with my environment variables directly inside of Odl as well. And the configuration extends a little bit beyond that. I'm definitely running out of time to go further than that, but you can also view those commands. Again, it's not a complete replacement for OC. We didn't actually need OC for any of this example, though. I had it running at the bottom just to show you guys that, yeah, this is what's going on, and this is how you can relate it back to concepts you already know. But really, I could have done all of that development work through Odl. And now that we've got that basics in place, which again took about a half an hour because of a lot of side talking from me, once that's in place, all it boils down to is I start editing my code. And Odl Watch is going to take care of pushing it into the cluster and making it running for me. And that drastically speeds up development time, makes it significantly smoother if I take out that entire image build process. And we distill it down to I write my code, and what I used to run in a terminal basically still runs in a terminal. And then magically everything appears inside of the cluster for me. With that, I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see Burr's lovely face again, who I know is extremely happy I use Java since all week I've been doing Python apps for the master courses. So I'm sure back there he's just like, good man, good man.
And the first question from DJ Maddie is, where's my Python? So how come you didn't show any Python?
Maddie, that makes me even happier. Not only that you've been with me all week, but that you were asking specifically for Python, so you just went up yet another step in my book. The Java example specifically, though, I like it because of the binary, that it does show that the binary builds isn't just necessarily a code sync thing, that it will sync a full-blown binary over. So that's the big takeaway there. The other thing being, I would love to do this demo one day where I don't even have Maven running locally or don't even have Node.js or Python, and all of my environment is purely in the cloud, and I've typed locally and it's synced up and ran it there.
And I did check with product management. The Python is coming. So Python Flask style application development, apparently it's not quite there is where we want to be yet, but it's coming soon, next 30, 60 days. Look for it. And then there was another question related to Spring-based backends. And I noticed you had a Spring-based backend for your current Java code. And Angular frontend. What about an Angular frontend? Have you looked at that?
I have not. I actually didn't even write this particular front end. I've written one in React, though, and had the exact same situation where it works just fine. At the end of the day, it's all boils down to the base image and how it interprets the code it gets. So it's going to rely on conventions. If I follow the proper conventions, package.json, or for Python, the requirements.txt, that base image is going to understand when it gets that code base, here's what I have to do with it. Gem files for your Ruby. Very similar to if you use source to image, how it'll do it. You have to follow the conventions correctly, but they're not like go out of your way to do weird conventions. It's just the actual language conventions.
Well, that is.
Since you can't hold me to it, I'm going to say Angular would work perfectly.
Yeah, and actually, I did ask some other people, and they thought it should work without a problem. We just got to find a way to test it. But at this point, we are out of time. I thank you all so much for listening with us, sticking with us this entire time. DJ Maddie's kind of been with us all week, and actually for the last several weeks, 6 weeks or so. And Waleed, I saw you in the chat, and Vin Kata, and thank you all so much for being here today. Jay, awesome stuff. I really love the demo ODO presentation. And then I'll have to remember not to put that exclamation point on my rights in VIA as well.
Yeah, my friend yelled at me real fast the first time I did that.
Yeah, exactly. But I thank you all. We have to sign off and get out of here. I got to actually jump to the next stream and for another meeting. But I thank you all for your time. And if you have any feedback, feel free to email me. You have my email address, or hit us on Twitter. I gave the Twitter handle for Jay earlier, I think, in the chat. If not, you know how to find him from previous sessions. But feel free to reach out to us, and we'll get back to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Take care, guys.